Welcome to Brookside Chats. I'm your host today, Brooklyn. With me, I have my two co-hosts, Pojo and Landry. And we have our special guest, Alex Young. Alex, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks guys for having me on the show. I appreciate it. So my name is Alex Young. I work for the University of Nebraska at Omaha. There I work with student leaders primarily, and I have a special interest in masculinity, gender theory in general. So I'm very excited to be on the show with you all.
Thank you. So today's topic is on masculinity. Can you give us a little rundown? What is masculinity, and what is some examples that you see today of that?
Sure. I think masculinity, when we talk about just in general, the best way I can describe it right now is it is the set of characteristics, behaviors, things like that that we generally attribute to men and boys. So these may be things like in our culture, being very reserved, not particularly emotional, being the breadwinner, those sorts of things that people readily think about when it comes to being a man. These things are generally put in like opposition to femininity. Again, things that we generally tend to know in our culture. It's pretty straightforward, but there's nuance there, and there's a whole field of study about gender and masculinity, and that's sort of where my background is.
Gotcha. So let's throw some examples of masculinity out there. So would you say Macho Man, Randy Savage is pinnacle masculinity, or?
One could say that. The big thing I want to stress is that masculinity is like any form of gender. Masculinity is very cultural. Mm-hmm. So what we think of as being masculine, being appropriate for men, varies from culture to culture by and large. So in some cultures it might be most appropriate for a man to do one thing, but that can be very different in another culture, right? So like in our culture, men don't wear dresses. That might be different in a different culture, and cultures can vary even within a specific geographic location as well. So these things are very cultural, but when you think about Macho Man Randy Savage, right, he is a specific kind of masculine that is, I'd say, a little bit more aggressive than most people find to be normal. But
what? No, he's
It's almost like he's playing it up.
Right. It's almost like it's all a show.
What?
What?
Them be
that's some fighting words, okay?
Anyways, back to that though.
I thought it was real.
So, is it bad to have too little masculinity, you would say, or is there some good examples of having like masculinity in general?
So it's difficult to say. So like it comes down to how do you want to define like one sense of masculinity. Like it could be between you and I, we can have different like definitions of masculinity, and those compare differently to like the cultural sense of what is appropriate. In gender theory, there is a specific form of masculinity called hegemonic masculinity that is seen as like the pinnacle that men try to like aspire to. Mm-hmm. I don't need to tell you all sort of like what that means, like the group in here, because if I tell you, what is a real man, quote unquote, you know instinctively what that means just because we were raised in a specific way, right? So when we talk about like having a certain amount of masculinity, that's kind of the wrong question. It's more like what kind of masculinity, what traits do you incorporate into your masculinity? And then we think about it in ways of how does your definition fit into the scheme of masculinity in the hierarchy, and how does it relate to that hegemonic masculinity? Because that hegemonic masculinity is something that we know and that men often strive for, but it's almost always unattainable, right? It is that it's an image, it's an ideal, it's not something very tangible or real that we can usually like get to.
It's more of an idea that we all want to strive for, and this and that, and like society wants to go for.
Right.
So this also kind of leads into a question I had as well. And I always hear about this term toxic masculinity, and when we're talking about this kind of idea, like this, the real man and stuff like that, is that also kind of like have a lot of underlying toxic masculinity like themes under it, where like people are just had this like idea of like gender norms and all that.
So I'm not a huge fan of the idea of like this like toxic masculinity. I think it's a little incomplete, like for me. I know it sparks some good conversation, and not everybody spends a great deal of time with gender theory, so I think it's worthwhile to talk about it. But when we talk about toxic masculinity, we're referring to a specific kind of masculinity that is toxic in the sense of it creates unhealthy patterns of behavior and thought that hold individuals back. So when people are challenging those things, they aren't necessarily saying, not most of the time, they aren't necessarily saying that men who men who consider themselves masculine are somehow bad. It's challenging like that certain definition of masculinity. And the impetus for that toxic masculinity does tend to be that striving for that hegemonic masculinity. Now, there may be elements of hegemonic masculinity, and again, hegemonic is just like it is the pinnacle in that specific cultural location. There may be elements of that masculinity that may or may not be toxic, but the toxicity comes from when we turn off our emotions, right, for the sake of trying to reach that hegemonic like ideal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, and this is just, we're all on the same page. From my understanding, this hegemonic masculinity, that is your ideal self. As you as a man, this is what you believe is the pinnacle.
That is what your culture is telling you is the pinnacle, and therefore we as like agents operating within that culture tend to strive for, because
like the kind of masculinity that refers to something like Superman or Flash Gordon or some kind of heroic ideal like that.
Right, exactly. It's all fed by cultural narratives, cultural ideologies, things that we grew up. So like I grew up watching a lot of James Bond movies.
Yeah.
So like James Bond, he very stoic, has lots of sex with lots of women. Those sorts of like elements fed into my sense of masculinity, and that hegemonic masculinity is what your specific culture, fed by those images and narratives, tells you is what we should be striving for. And unfortunately, if we're not particularly aware like of that force, that drawing force, like when we're younger, it often leads to that sense of toxicity. It leads to us making choices that aren't particularly good for us or those around you, things like that.
Gotcha.
So, how would one go about changing this culture from what some consider a toxic masculinity or the heterochromatic? That's not the right word, I know.
Learn some English, man.
It's hard. But how would you go about changing that culture? Would it be on an individual level? Would it be, like as you said, like putting out a movie where it's kind of like the opposite of James Bond, showing that it's okay to feel emotions and it's okay not to, have copious amounts of sex?
Right. No, I think there's definitely things that we can do like to help rewrite that narrative. So the first thing I would say is to recognize that gender and sex, like both of those two things, because those things are different, they exist like in a spectrum, right? So like gender is not like black and white, it's not like masculine and feminine. There are plenty of cultures out there that have genders like outside the binary. Like I know plenty of people who are not like gender binary, right? So recognizing that those things are real, those are normal, like is the first step. So like we can welcome nuance like into the conversation. And then I think from there it takes personal work and it takes structural work. So from the personal level, it's about being mindful of yourself, your sense of gender, your sense of masculinity, what exactly you like want to be, what kind of person you want to be, how do you want to define your own masculinity that isn't necessarily tied to, you know, the cultural sense of masculinity or even the masculinity of your friends. Because one thing we know about gender is that it is very reinforced by the people who are around us, right? So, you know, if you are in, say, like a fraternity, your sense of gender, your sense of masculinity is probably very like enforced and like reinforced by the interactions that you have. So like if your fraternity has a sense of masculinity that is very much about sexual conquest and like disregard for like women's right to say no, you're probably gonna find yourself in an environment that encourages you to live out a specific kind of masculinity that may lead to sexual assault, right? So like challenging yourselves, but also challenging your friends in that way. That's, you know, happening, you know, on the individual, like the micro level.
Yeah.
Then on the macro level, you know, going off what you said, you know, creating more art and media and visualizations and representations of various kinds of masculinities. My favorite that I like to go to is the movie Kubo and the Magic Strings, or I can't remember what the movie is called. It's a Disney movie, and it featured a young boy as the protagonist, and it was all about like his journey as a coming of age and finding himself, and he expressed much more like emotion than most boys are permitted to. We've seen, I think, I would say probably in the most, you know, like 10 years, some of the most diverse representations of masculinity like in mass media than I think we've seen in a long time.
Quick side note.
Go ahead.
Have you seen the trailers for Cry Macho?
I don't think so.
I think what you were talking about, that's what it's aiming for. Because I've only seen the trailer because it's not out yet. But like even in the trailer, it's like put that old masculine BS crying is for girls away,
right?
Whatnot.
So I wanted to piggyback off of what you were talking about earlier, and about separating masculinity and femininity from gender, because I'm totally in favor of that. I think the essence of toxic masculinity and femininity is saying that you have to have these certain traits in order to healthily identify as a man or a woman. And I was lucky enough not to be brought up in an atmosphere that was like that. I think that, you know, I had my father in my life. I still do, obviously. He wasn't the kind of father to raise me to be like, don't cry if you're feeling sad, and you know, hang out with lots of women to try and get with them, and you know, you have to do sports and you have to do this, that, and the next thing in order to really be a true man. I grew up around a lot of men in my life who had a variety of different interests and way of emotionally expressing themselves, and they all got along swimmingly, which was a really good atmosphere, I think, growing up as a boy in America, because I agree there is a lot of toxic masculinity in this society, especially in fraternity life, as you were saying. I know quite a few guys who are, not necessarily at this school, but I know quite a few guys who subscribe to that in a really unhealthy way, and their identity as a man hinges on this masculine ideal, and if you threaten that masculinity at all, it's not pretty. I was lucky enough to fall into social groups in school and in college where it wasn't like that at all. We were very much got emotionally intimate with each other, where, you know, we could talk about our problems in a healthy way and be sad, and we were all supportive of each other. So I think that untying masculinity and femininity from gender identity is a great idea, because I think that when you have such a strong link to a masculine ideal and identifying as a man, if you can't live up to that, it's harmful to your ability to identify as yourself.
Exactly. And I want to really call out what you said. You grew up with, like your dad gave you a lot of permission to like express yourself, right? And that's super duper important. So like so much like dads, coaches, pastors, like those sorts of like people who boys look to have so much power to help like rewrite that narrative. It's really heartwarming to hear that your dad had that experience, because that was not my experience with my dad.
Yeah, my dad, it was kind of an interesting sort of thing. I think there was a bit of growing involved. I don't know where he was at the beginning when I was very young, but he's a big sports fan, always has been, always will be. He named me after the coach of the Dallas Cowboys. That's why my name's Landry. Yeah, he's from Texas. So...
Oh, there it is. Okay.
Yeah, there's
yeah, but he was never, the gun-toting redneck Republican. He's a conservative Christian male, but that's not necessarily inherently wrong. He wanted me to play sports from a young age, and he did push me into that stuff because, when you're a 3 to 12-year-old kid, you're still figuring out who you are, and I wasn't gonna voluntarily go out and try all these different things, so he was pushing me here and there. So when I got into theater and choir in high school and left sports, I was expecting there to be a lot of pushback because I complained about sports as a child, and he made me do it anyway. And I realize now that was more about sticking to my commitments and learning how to work as a team. But I was expecting some pushback when I didn't do any sports in high school and went fully into the arts side. But, he was like right at my back the whole time, loved watching me on stage. And he told me that, his getting to go to homecoming football game to watch his son play ended up just being, the spring play my senior year or something like that. And that was definitely integral in my identity as a man and my connection to masculinity, I think.
Right. That's awesome. So like that's a really important like distinction, right? When is it like you're forcing like your son to do something that they don't want to do, and when is it about like encouraging them to stick to their convictions, right? So it wasn't necessarily that it had to be sports. Your dad wanted to give you something about like sticking to your convictions, being a good team player, even if it was something else. So like he didn't force you, he encouraged you to to spread your wings, right?
Yes.
So that's awesome. I love that.
I guess if you're curious about my story, not that it matters, not that like my name's on the podcast or anything like that.
No, please share.
I want to hear it.
Brooklyn,
So-
tell us your story.
So, Brooke came from Brooke Berninger, a backup QB from Nebraska, actually, that died from a plane crash about a year before I was born. And living in that like kind of toxic masculinity kind of like environment, my father was always like pushing me to do some type of sports. Like right off on the gate, I was like involved in basketball, soccer, football, like all these other things, just because I guess my father had like this idea of like being the hometown kid that was like, oh, the star athlete in like a town of like 300 people. So it was always a weird environment. I always never kind of connected with him, that idea, and it was just like the idea of like being self-independent. It was always kind of like that kind of masculine idea, or like kind of just avoiding like certain like subject matter, certain it was always kind of like this niche, like you gotta think this way, you can't reveal emotions, you can't do that. I always had that kind of like background growing up, but like, it is kind of really relieving to kind of like be out of that environment, be able to express yourself, be able to kind of like be you, because we are humans, we have a range of emotions. It's not good to suppress them. We're social creatures, and to back up this stuff, to back up my, not just my anecdotal story, but like a lot of this idea of toxic masculinity, you'll find there's a study from the National Institute of Health where they say like a lot of people that are going through those like masculine stages in their life, they tend to have a very high depression rate or a very high suicidal rate because they always feel like they have to take on all the weight in the world by themselves. They always have to take on everything by themselves. So I guess that's my 2 cents.
No, you are you are very right. It's not just about the things that you have to do. It's also about the things that you're not allowed to do, right? So you're not allowed to show emotion. You're not allowed to, ask for help. You're not allowed to, so help you if you turn out not to be straight, right? Like, those are very, very damaging things. And it shouldn't be, right? Because we're human. We have emotions and we need other people, and we can't do it all on our own. And that's why it becomes so toxic, right? And that's why it's so damaging. And I want to really stress that when we talk about oh, it's toxic, it's bad, I'm not saying that all elements of masculinity are toxic or bad. When we critique these cultural notions of gender, or even when we critique cultural notions of anything, I really want to stress that we aren't attacking anyone individually. I'll critique people on the individual level if they're doing something shitty, but a good example of this is when we so let's talk about the game Monopoly, right? I'm assuming you all have played the game Monopoly, right?
Unfortunately.
Go to jail 200.
Right, exactly.
Ugh.
So most people in the United States have probably played Monopoly. So Monopoly, when you play it right, it makes you do things, right? The rules make you do shitty things to each other, things that you wouldn't normally do.
Yeah.
Right. If you take yourself out of that context, you change your behavior. We are critiquing the rules of Monopoly, not the person playing it. In that sense, we can critique them, when they do something shitty, but we also need to remember that they're, operating in the in that cultural framework and have those rules. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
I've never heard it quite laid out like that before, but that's really nice.
Don't hit the player, hit the game.
As long as the player isn't doing something really shitty. I also really want to stress that we should critique each other if we are doing shitty things, but we also need to have that. I think, anyways, we need to have that sense of empathy for okay, where does this behavior come from, and understanding that, but still hold people accountable.
Yeah.
If nothing else, just the benefit of the doubt, I guess.
Assume
Usually.
good intent.
Usually, I think it. If you don't have anything else to go on, then yeah, assume good intent.
So I always see a lot of culture wars with kind of a lot of conservative talking points and stuff like that. Is that also somewhat related with masculinity? Because I know for instance, earlier this year, Lil Nas put blood in some sneakers, and everyone was really outraged. Or it was the music video Montenegro, Call Me By Your Name, and it was just kind of just because he was gay that he's doing all these moves and stuff like that. And I kind of want to sit on this point of is that just kind of that conservative toxic masculinity of just you need to be our image and we're upset because of how you're perceiving yourself? Because at the same time, didn't Tony Hawk put a drop of blood in some skates or something like that, and
I think something like that.
And no one bat an eye or anything about that, or said anything about it.
Wait, so Little Nas was selling shoes with his blood in it?
He was trying to sell them earlier in March, and basically there's just a lot of outrage.
Yeah, there was a lot of backlash for that.
I feel like that's more of a health thing. Maybe that's just me. Because selling blood doesn't seem ethical.
Yeah, but I said,
no, I get it.
It's art.
yeah,
I don't know.
It doesn't actually matter.
Yeah.
Well, I think art
don't.
matters. Well, so
that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the fact that it is art and what it is doesn't matter with what the backlash is really against.
Right. I don't remember. I can't remember if it was his blood or what exactly happened with that. But the pushback, a lot of it came from his specific brand of gender and of his queerness that is very like very like counter to to that hegemonic like standard. And I want to stress, like, not all conservatives might feel this way, but a conservative person who feels that gender should be performed within a narrow scope, they're of course going to feel a specific kind of way about that. So like it isn't really it isn't particularly shocking. I also want to point out that like Lil Nas, as like a black man, like also has that element of race like playing into his experience. So he lives in that intersection of his race and of sexuality and of his gender. That makes it intersectionality, right? Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, I am taking a class actually.
Hey, so he lives in that intersection, right? And that compounds things more. So like when people see him, they're seeing him not just as as a gay man, they're seeing him also as a black gay man, and that has additional like complications and layers there from within his own community. I know, talking to some queer black people that I know, and they feel a specific kind of way. I'm not going to tell their story for them, but there's an element there of like, oh, I can't imagine having done that. Like what he does, his art is very bold in that sense. And that boldness, can come at a social cost. But he's also been very fortunate to, it's also been very nice to see that he's received a lot of support in that as well.
So I have some words on this as far as conservative commentators.
We like
and
words.
Masculinity. Yeah, that's
real quick.
Kind of what this whole
This
thing
is social conservative, not economic.
Yes, social conservatism.
Yes.
I have thoughts on that as well, but you continue.
I am a fiscal conservative, but I'm not necessarily a social conservative. But back in high school, I definitely was, which is to this.
I apologize. I retract that.
So I used to watch a lot of conservative commentators back in high school, and I think that part of my shifting stance on this is I've changed, and I think they have also changed, because this sort of Donald Trump atmosphere that's come forward in the last 4, 5, 6 years has been really, really rough for conservatives. If you watch people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson and whoever else, that kind of ilk of media personality, there's a certain way that they were before Trump, and then a certain way that they are now in a post-Trump world, and a lot of their rhetoric really centers around this douchey, arrogant idea of a lib-trolling American or red-blooded American man, destroying libs with facts and logic, that kind of a thing. And it's been really hard to watch a lot of my conservative friends kind of fall down that rabbit hole of, thinking that they're better than everyone else because of their social beliefs. And on top of that, it's also been I almost want to say reactionary social beliefs, because it's kind of beyond conservatism at this point. Going back to that 1950s traditional heterosexual man with a wife, 2 kids, and a dog.
Nuclear family.
Protestant Christian, probably. If we're talking about like the down the line stereotypes of what the American man, quote unquote, should be. And I think that definitely plays into how the reaction was against Lil Nas X.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I think there's definitely an element of like gender plays out everywhere, and I think if you have a more conservative worldview, you're more likely to to be rigid in your sense of gender. So I think that makes perfect sense.
Or just kind of like how they try to relate religious beliefs, according to the Bible, marriage is with man and woman, and that was kind of like a constant backlash of that.
Right. No, that's a thing that we saw. For me though, as a very strong atheist, I don't particularly care what the Bible says. It doesn't really have an impact, I think, in the way that like our government and our rights are structured. Personally,
Yeah.
So like there's just that element there, but I think that I want to insert more nuance. Like it is true to say that there was that conservative backlash, and I do think there is that movement. For folks who might be a little bit more rightward leaning to fall into that Ben Shapiro sort of like mentality, but I do think that there is still significant amounts of like diversity within that ideological spectrum.
No, I completely agree. There is a lot of diversity. In fact, I consider myself part of that diverse group. I center a little more right wing in my political beliefs, fiscally at the very least. But with the way that the media is portraying it, I don't know if that's quite how I want to say it. The way that the vocal plurality, perhaps, is shutting everything else down. It's making conservatives look monolithic in modern culture, which is totally unhealthy.
Right, and that's true. I think of both the left and the right. That sense of like creating the monolith. Also, good word, like monolithic. That's a very
Thank you.
That's a
I
cool
took an English class.
good for you.
Wow.
Pretty sure that was a thing in the 2001 Space Odyssey.
That was, yes,
Monolith.
different, but yes.
You're not wrong. Is the thing.
It doesn't have the ick in it, so
it's just a monolith.
Monolithic is an adjective.
there you go.
Anyway,
So not only are you learning about masculinity in this podcast, but you're also taking a grammar lesson.
And the culture war that doesn't really need to exist.
There you go.
For some reason.
there's
Right.
a lot of things that don't need to exist but do. Anyways.
Yeah. Anyway, and the idea of the culture war, which I think is a really interesting sort of idea. Like culture is always in a state of flux. Like culture isn't just, like you said, like a monolithic thing. It is like a construct between like all of us, right? So our standards, our beliefs, our values all feed into culture, and those things change over time, right? Like we see it change, and unfortunately, if it changes in a way that is different than the way you feel it should be, or the way that is appropriate, that can be really, really jarring and really, really terrifying and really, really uncomfortable.
Well, and if I may jump in real quick, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Go for
isn't that with most generations? How there's usually the cultural, and then there's the countercultural movement, like in the 60s, how it became more free love and whatnot.
Yes, and I would also say, like, when it came to like that time period and like the free love, it like there was a sense of liberation, but a lot of liberation was actually much more for women than men, because men were already having a lot of sex with people, like random people.
Well, yeah, no, that's an example I was
Right.
pulling out.
Yeah, so yeah, there is a, like I said, it's dynamic, it changes, and it can sometimes go in sort of like a dialectic cycle. So it might swing one way and then swings back the other way, and then somehow finding a median, and then like the pendulum keeps swinging.
Yep.
So with all that in mind, with the way that it usually is, I guess that we've been saying, it's interesting that today it seems to be two probably equally prevalent sides of the so-called culture war that are seen as monolithic by the other, going back and forth over these issues. Because I don't know if that's ever really been seen before, at least not since the Civil War.
I would say it's probably been seen. I mean, the 50s, 60s, 70s, like the civil rights movement wasn't really that long ago. Like I would say that's probably been, a good comparison to where we are. Granted, we're not seeing the same like degree of fire hoses blasting people off the sidewalk, but it's definitely, I think, been seen before, and probably relatively more recent than most people think. Like this is, I think, from my perspective, this is just something that happens as we change as a culture, and sometimes that change is more abrupt and more friction filled. So that I think is, I'm not gonna say it's normal, I'm not gonna say it's good, it's just something that I think happens.
So would you say that we're in probably the crucible right now? Not the Miller play, but I mean like in the sense that we're in a really hot time in our cultural development, and that we're going to see more solid change pretty soon?
I couldn't tell you for sure because I'm not a historian in that sense, but
I just mean your personal speculation.
my personal speculation is that we aren't done yet. I think it's going to get hotter. Because I think we haven't had a cultural reckoning to the degree that I think we would need in order to actually address it.
So, in summary, though, would you say that there will be kind of a final boiling point with masculinity, or like kind of you say gender norms, or what would that look like?
I think if we see like a significant change, it will happen before we realize it's happened, and then we'll sort of accept it just like as it is. There will always be elements that people will challenge and critique and point out. I don't think that's ever going to change. But when change does happen, I think it's oftentimes we see like, oh, it happened and we didn't realize it. So I don't think we're going to see like some person on the television say we've entered the new age. I don't think that's just going to be a thing. But we'll eventually reach a point where we've decided together, maybe not consciously, but as a culture, that we expect something different. And I think that's where we will find ourselves eventually. I don't know if it will be tomorrow, next month, 10 years from now, but I think we will see change over time because that's always how it happens.
Good. So, in summary, today we talked about masculinity. We talked about different like culture wars that are kind of interrelating with masculinity, and how we're thinking that it's going to progress with like the different sides of like masculinity, and just how society and culture will change. So, thank you for being a guest, Alex.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And this is Brookside Chats signing off.